My name is Lucas. I'm 26 years old and work as an assistant at a small convenience store in the center of a town that can hardly be called a town. I've lived my entire life in one of those sleepy little towns where nothing really happens, and people do what they do every day until everything becomes an unchanging routine. There's nothing special about me or my life. I'm just one of those average types who go unnoticed, with nothing to stand out. My shifts always start at p.m. and end at a.m. It's a lonely time when the store becomes a microcosm, a bubble in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes I find myself watching the gas station lights flickering outside, as if they're trying to call me to something, but most of the time, they're just the same lights as always. Still, there's something comforting about those endless routines. On the night everything started, I was getting ready for another shift, as usual, and the manager handed me the schedule like she always does. She's a middle-aged woman with short hair and that tired look of someone who's seen and done everything there is to do in a lifetime. She handed me 2 sheets of paper, as if it were something simple. One of them had my daily tasks restocking products, cleaning the bathrooms, checking the cash registers, things I could do with my eyes closed. The other sheet was different. It was covered with small handwriting, like something that couldn't be forgotten. "Here are the instructions for the night shift," she said, in the same monotone voice as always. "Follow them carefully, especially the rules on the second page." I went to the small back room where the flickering light cast a weak glow on the table. I started reading the papers, thinking it would just be another routine shift. The instructions seemed simple. Always check the cameras, turn off the lights when visitors arrive, don't let anyone leave without paying, and so on. But then I came across a name on the second sheet. Fred. The handwriting looked rushed, but what caught my attention was what was written next to the name. "Avoid interaction at all costs. What's this?" I muttered to myself, but Anne's voice quickly interrupted my thoughts. "Don't worry about that. Just follow the instructions. Everything will be fine," she said, not even looking at me. But it stuck in my mind. Fred. Who was he? What was so important that Anne didn't want me asking questions? Before I could ask anything more, Anne was already heading to her car parked in the back. The shift was mine as always. The sound of the door closing behind her was the last thing I heard before I was alone, surrounded by the dim light of the store and the vastness of the night outside. When the last customer left, a woman who bought a single pack of candy and paid with exactly $2, the atmosphere in the store seemed to change somehow. It felt heavier, but there was no reason for it. It was just another routine shift. I turned on the TV in the break room and picked up a book I had started reading weeks ago. On the screen, nothing interesting. The TV program was always the same. Even the clock seemed slower at night, like time was tired of moving. I sat in the plastic chair, and as I tried to focus on my reading, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow moving on the security monitor. I froze, the book falling from my hand. It was no one, just the reflection of the outside lights bouncing off the cameras. Still, something about it didn't feel right. The reflection was different. It seemed to move a little faster than it should have. I closed my eyes for a moment and shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But there was something about that movement I couldn't ignore. That shadow followed me throughout the shift somehow. It was like I knew I wasn't alone, even though there was nothing there. The clock kept ticking, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on my work, the thought of Fred wouldn't leave my mind. Avoid interaction at all costs. My only friend, if you could call him that, is Ju, a guy who works the afternoon shift at the same store. He's in his early 30s, wears thick glasses, and is always chewing on something. He's only my friend because we've had to talk to get through the boredom of the job. Even so, Ju gets the monotony of our work, so our conversations are at least bearable. Anything new on the shift? I asked the morning after everything happened. He had just arrived to cover the next shift. Same as always. People paying with coins and complaining about prices. He shrugged, chewing on what looked like a granola bar. How was your night? I hesitated. The name Fred was still fresh in my mind, but it seemed silly to bring it up. Besides, who's to say Ju knew anything? Quiet. Just the usual sounds of shelves creaking and cameras buzzing. I lied, trying to sound casual. Ju laughed awkwardly, as if he was waiting for me to say more. When I didn't continue, he pointed at the rules sheet I was still holding. Oh, the night rules. The store owner wrote those, you know. The guy's paranoid, he said, making air quotes with his fingers. Standard procedures. It's all just nonsense to avoid lawsuits. I gave a nervous laugh, but couldn't stop myself from asking, "Who's Fred?" Ju stopped chewing. He stared at me for a moment, looking blank, before letting out an uncomfortable, forced laugh. Man, I don't know. Never seen anyone by that name around here. Probably just Anne's paranoia. There was something in his tone that bothered me, but I let it go. I didn't have any proof he was lying, and pushing him wouldn't get me anywhere. Still, the name, Fred, stuck to my mind like chewing gum on a sneaker. On my next shift, I started paying more attention to the cameras. The monitors showed blurry, poorly lit images, like the store existed in a limbo of low quality. During the first few hours, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The clock kept ticking slowly as I checked the stock and cleaned the shelves. Around AM, however, something new happened. On the camera that looked down the drink aisle, I saw a man standing with his back to the camera. He was wearing a heavy coat and was completely still like a statue. I left the counter and walked down the aisle, trying not to think the worst. But when I turned the corner, there was no one there. I looked around, checking between the shelves and even near the entrance, but the place was empty. I returned to the security room, my heart racing, and replayed the footage. The man was still there. He hadn't moved, but he vanished as soon as I went to investigate. The next day, I mentioned it to Ju. Maybe it was just some interference. Have you seen how old those cameras are? He said casually, but there was something in his expression that bothered me. A sort of tension, like he knew more than he was letting on. After my story, he quickly changed the subject, starting to complain about the snack stock. But before he left the store that day, he turned to me and said something that made me freeze. Oh, just one thing. If Fred shows up, don't try to be a hero, okay? He smiled, but there was no humor in his voice. I wanted to ask what he knew, but by the time I realized, I was already alone again. That night, I couldn't relax. Every little sound seemed amplified, every shadow darker. Fred was still just a name, but he was starting to gain a weight I couldn't ignore. Around AM, a woman came into the store. She seemed rushed, her eyes full of worry. She bought a bottle of water and paid in silence. As she was about to leave, she hesitated, looking at me as if she wanted to say something. "You're new here, right?" she asked finally. I nodded, curious. "Just a tip. Be careful with what shows up on the cameras. Not everything is as it seems." And with that, she left, without offering any further explanation. I stood there, thinking about what she'd said. The cameras were just machines. They couldn't lie, could they? But what about what I'd seen the night before? And why did everyone seem to speak in riddles when it came to Fred? That night, for the first time, I began to wonder if this job was really just another regular gig. The night started off quiet, at least at first. I spent most of the shift reorganizing the candy shelves and listening to quiet music on my headphones, trying to ignore the growing discomfort inside me. But something had changed. It was like, with each shift, the store was becoming heavier, for lack of a better word. Around AM, the intercom buzzed. That old, worn-out device was rarely used, since it only connected to the security room. I answered without thinking much. "Hello?" Silence. "Who's there?" I asked, now more alert. A faint, almost imperceptible breath came from the other side. My skin crawled. "If this is some kind of prank, it's not funny," I muttered, feeling my throat dry. More silence. Then a single word whispered. "Leave." My body froze. I dropped the intercom like it was hot and looked around. The store was empty. I could hear the low hum of the fridge in the drinks aisle, but nothing else. I tried to convince myself it was just interference, maybe someone on the outside tapping into the line, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I went back to the security room, my heart racing faster than it should have. I reviewed the footage from the day, looking for something that could explain it. That's when I noticed something odd. For a moment, I thought it was just fatigue or paranoia, but it wasn't. In the footage, the clock on the drink aisle camera showed 2:32, but the one at the store entrance said 2:29. A 3-minute discrepancy. It seemed impossible, but the feeling that something defied logic was undeniable. Minutes later, as I watched the monitors, I saw him again. The same man in the heavy coat standing in the aisle. This time, he was facing the camera. His face was blurred, as if the recording had failed, but I could see clearly that he was staring at me. Or rather, staring at the camera, as if he knew I was watching him. I stood up, nervous, and walked toward the aisle, trying not to make a sound. When I turned the corner, it was empty again. The air felt colder, denser. My hands were shaking as I returned to the security room. The footage still showed the man motionless, staring directly at me. I didn't know what to do. The next morning, I mentioned it to Ju again. This time, I went straight to the point. "Have you seen anyone strange on the cameras? A man in a heavy coat?" He stopped what he was doing, chewing slowly on a piece of bread. His expression wasn't one of surprise, but of something more complicated. "I'm not going to lie to you," he began after a long silence. "I've heard stories about weird stuff happening here, but I've always preferred not to know. I think sometimes it's better that way. Are you serious?" I replied, incredulous. "And Fred, does he have anything to do with this?" Ju avoided my gaze, finishing chewing before he answered. "Man, just follow the rules. That's what I do." He didn't say anything else, and I knew it wouldn't help to press him. The conversation left me more anxious than ever. That night, I decided to test something. I arrived earlier to review the camera schedules. I wanted to see if the 3-minute issue was something isolated or if it was recurring. It didn't take long to realize it was worse than I imagined. Each camera seemed to operate on slightly different times. It wasn't something visible live, but when comparing the recordings, I noticed small lapses seconds that disappeared, events that didn't make sense. Then something strange happened. Around AM, the lights in the store started flickering. This had happened before, but never so persistently. I looked at the monitors and saw something that made my heart stop for a second. All the cameras were offline. I grabbed the radio, desperate, trying to reach someone, anyone. "This is the store. The cameras are down. Is anyone here?" No answer. The radio only emitted a soft static, followed by a sound that resembled a distant crack. When I looked back at the monitors, one camera came back online. It was the one in the drinks aisle, and there he was again, The man in the coat, standing still, staring directly at the lens. This time, I didn't go to check. Something told me that if I left the room, things would get much worse. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway, near the monitoring room door. The steps outside were slow, calculated. I knew that if someone was really out there, it didn't make sense to just wait. So, I gathered all the courage I could, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Who's there?" The sound stopped instantly. An absolute silence filled the place. The only noise came from the monitor in front of me, showing the empty drinks aisle. The man in the coat had disappeared. I decided to leave. I grabbed the wooden bat we kept behind the counter, a security item I never thought I'd need, and slowly opened the door. The hallway was deserted, but something caught my attention. A small metallic noise coming from the back of the store. I followed the sound with cautious steps, every muscle in my body on high alert. The noise seemed to be coming from the stock area. When I got there, I found the place intact, except for one detail. The old cash register we had stored was open. Inside there was a brown envelope. My name was written by hand on the front, in a firm but almost illegible handwriting. I hesitated before picking it up, but curiosity won out. As I opened it, I found an old black and white photo. It showed the store, but in a different state, almost unrecognizable. The building seemed newer, with a sign I had never seen before. In front of the store, a group of people were posing for the camera. I recognized Fred immediately, though he was younger. Next to him was a woman and two small children, and in the background, there was the man in the coat, standing with his hands in his pockets, staring at the camera. His face was blurred in the photo, exactly as it appeared on the monitors. I swallowed hard and put the photo in my pocket, feeling the ground beneath me grow more unstable with every passing second. When I returned to the monitoring room, I tried to confront Fred on the radio. "I need to talk to you now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This time, he responded almost immediately. "What's going on?" "The store, the photo, the man. You know what I'm talking about." There was a long pause. Then, Fred's voice came back, quieter, almost a whisper. "Don't mess with this. Just do your job." I turned off the radio, irritated. His response only confirmed what I had already suspected. He knew something. The next night, I returned to work with a plan. I spent the morning researching the history of the building, but didn't find much. Some records mentioned that the store had been built on the remains of an old sawmill, but there were no specific details. However, a quick conversation with Ju before my shift revealed something unexpected. That photo, the one you mentioned. "I've seen something like that before," he said, looking around as if afraid to be heard. "What? Where?" I asked, feeling the adrenaline spike. "Fred. He keeps things." In the basement, it was a place I'd never visited, as Fred kept the area locked. I had always assumed it was just a storage room, but now it seemed unlikely. I spent the night watching the monitors, waiting for the right moment. Around AM, when the store was completely dead, I grabbed the keychain that Fred kept on the counter and went down to the basement. The door was old, with rust marks around the lock. When I finally managed to unlock it, a musty smell of mold and old wood filled the air. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and descended the creaking stairs. The basement was bigger than I expected, with shelves full of documents and stacked boxes. But what caught my attention was a table in the corner, covered with yellowed papers and old photos. Among them, I found more pictures of the man in the coat. In each photo, he was in different places in the store, but always with his face blurred. There was also a list of names and dates. Next to each name, the word "missing" was written in red ink. My heart raced when I saw that my name was at the end of the list, with the date marked for that very month. Before I could process what that meant, I heard footsteps above me. Someone was at the top of the stairs. I turned off the flashlight and pressed myself against the nearest wall, trying to blend into the darkness of the basement. The only thing separating me from the intruder was the door, which I had left ajar. The footsteps came closer, then stopped right at the entrance. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the absolute silence. I gripped my phone tightly, almost praying that the person on the other side would give up. The door slowly creaked open, a sound that resonated like a scream. A silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs, lit only by the weak light from the store upstairs. I couldn't see the face, but there was something unsettling about the way the person moved, slowly but purposefully, as if they knew exactly where I was. Before the figure could come down, a sound of glass breaking echoed from the store. The intruder hesitated for a moment, then hurried back. I took the chance to leave the basement. I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could, closed the door, and locked it again. Back in the monitoring room, I reviewed the footage from the last few hours. The man in the coat was once again in the drinks aisle, motionless like a statue. But what was most disturbing was that, at one point, he simply disappeared from the camera, as if he had never been there. Fred was involved in this, I was sure. And now, everything pointed to that man being something much more dangerous than just a strange customer. I grabbed the list of names I had found in the basement and started researching the disappearances. It took me some time, but I finally found information on 3 people whose names were on the list. They had all worked at or had some connection to the store before they vanished. Police reports described the disappearances as mysterious, with no conclusive leads. The oldest record was from 1983, about a young woman named Clara. According to the records, she was only 19 years old and was last seen leaving a night shift. The most terrifying detail was that the descriptions from the time mentioned a man in a dark coat as the last person seen speaking with her. The patterns were clear. It was as if the store was a magnet for this kind of thing, but no one seemed willing to talk about it. I spent the night trying to uncover more about the man. I scoured forums, social media, and even obscure blogs that discussed urban legends and paranormal events. Nothing led me to a specific name or origin, but I found something that made me uneasy. Similar stories involving figures that appeared and disappeared in random places, always leaving a trail of inexplicable disappearances. The next night, I arrived early for my shift. Fred was in the office and seemed more irritated than usual. I decided to confront him. "Fred, I need answers. Who is the man in the coat?" He stared at me with a hard expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, curtly. "Don't lie to me. I found the photo in the basement, the list of names. Clara, Jew, Luana. You knew about all of this, didn't you?" He hesitated for a second, long enough for me to realize he was hiding something. "If I were you, I'd drop it. You have no idea what you're messing with. Then explain it to me." I yelled. "Why am I on the list?" Fred looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "You've already seen what he wants you to see. From this point on, there's no going back." I didn't know how to respond. Fred grabbed his things and left the store without saying another word. I was alone again. And once again, the man appeared. The following days became a blur of paranoia. The routine, once simple, seemed to be collapsing under the weight of something invisible. The man in the coat was always there, but never predictably. Some nights, he would appear on the cameras for just a few seconds, staring directly into the lens before disappearing. On other nights, he would stay for hours, motionless like a statue, in dark corners of the store that I only noticed after reviewing the footage. I stopped trusting Fred. Since our last conversation, he barely looked in my direction. In fact, he avoided showing up for work altogether, leaving vague messages on the phone. "Don't mess with this anymore," was the last thing he said before abruptly hanging up. I was left alone in the store for nights on end, trying to pretend that it was still just a job, but everything had changed. I started reviewing the footage obsessively, creating imaginary patterns and writing down anything that seemed out of place. Sleeping became a luxury I could no longer afford. There was always something to uncover, some missing piece. One night, while watching the footage again, I noticed something new. A regular customer, a young woman with a shopping bag, passed by the man in the coat. The moment she crossed his path, she staggered slightly, as if she had felt an invisible impact. She looked around, confused, but kept walking. I rewound and watched the scene repeatedly. The pattern was the same. It wasn't just glances or disappearances. Every time someone crossed the man's path, something changed. I needed to understand. The next night, I went down to the basement. Even though I knew it was risky, I started searching through the boxes and old papers again. The list of names I had found earlier seemed incomplete. There was a sealed envelope at the bottom of a pile of old records. Inside, I found a diary. It was Clara's, the young woman who had disappeared in 1983. The pages were faded, but still legible. In the early entries, she talked about working at the store, the financial struggles, normal things. But at some point, the tone changed drastically. "He's here again. Always standing in the same hallway, as if he's waiting for something. No one else seems to notice. Am I going crazy?" The subsequent entries became increasingly disjointed. She described disturbing dreams, a growing feeling of being watched, and finally a decision to confront him. The last page was stained and almost illegible, but two sentences were still clear. "He knows who we are. I won't come back." My hands trembled as I closed the diary. Fred knew all of this, and still, he did nothing. I decided to confront the man in the coat. I could no longer pretend he was just a strange figure or a coincidence. That night, while he was in the drink aisle, I went up to him. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed to betray me with every step. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't move, not even a reaction. "What do you want from me?" His silence was worse than any answer he could have given. But then, he slowly turned his head in my direction. There was no face. The scream caught in my throat. It was as if I were looking into an absolute void, an absence of everything. And yet, I felt as though he were looking at me, examining every thought I had. I took a step back, tripping over a pile of products. When I blinked, he had vanished. From that moment on, I began to distrust everything and everyone. My coworkers looked at me with concern, but I knew there was something wrong with them too. When I tried to ask Fred about Clara and the diary, he denied knowing anything, but his expression said otherwise. The events began to accumulate. Objects in my house were out of place. Doors that I was sure I had locked were open. My phone vibrated in the middle of the night with unknown numbers, but no one was on the line. I no longer knew what was real. I knew I was alone in this. Fred wouldn't say a thing. My coworkers pretended not to notice what was happening, and the faceless man seemed more and more like a fragment of my own sanity disintegrating. I needed answers, but I also knew no one would hand them to me on a silver platter. I went back to Clara's diary, reading the stained pages as if they were a manual for survival. Her description started to make sense when I noticed something I had ignored before. Clara mentioned a name, Miriam, repeatedly. She wasn't a coworker or a customer, but someone outside the store's circle. I researched online, searched for records, and finally found a lead. Miriam was an elderly woman who lived alone in a remote neighborhood. She had apparently been a colleague of Clara before her disappearance. When I knocked on Miriam's door, the cutting midnight wind seemed to mock me. The door opened slowly, revealing a hunched woman with dark eyes and a suspicious expression. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. "I need to talk about Clara." I showed her the diary, and I saw the hesitation in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she would send me away, but something in her posture shifted. She opened the door, motioning for me to come inside. The interior of Miriam's house seemed frozen in time. Old photographs, worn furniture, and a pile of newspapers stacked in a corner. She offered me tea, but the silence that followed was unbearable. I didn't know how to begin. "You're messing with something you should have left behind," she said, breaking the silence. "I can't. He won't let me." She stared at me, and I could sense the weight of what she knew. "Clara tried to warn us, but no one listened. No one listened because no one wants to believe he's real. He doesn't belong to this world. That's what makes him so dangerous." My throat went dry. I didn't know whether to ask or just listen. "Who is he?" I asked. "It's not who. It's what. He feeds on your doubt, on your obsession. He grows every time you look, every time you think of him. That's what destroyed Clara." I asked Miriam to explain more, but she just shook her head. "If you want answers, you have to find them for yourself. I've come too close already. I'm not going back." The conversation with Miriam only confirmed what I had already sensed. I was facing something that transcended any logic or reason. But there was still something she said that wouldn't leave my mind. "He grows with obsession." For days, I tried to ignore the man. I focused on my routine, did everything I could to avoid checking the cameras, even turned the system off entirely. But he was still there, in the shadows of the store, at the corners of my vision. Always present, always waiting. One night, while reviewing the old records once again, something jumped out at me. It wasn't the man this time, but patterns. Exact dates and times when he appeared. Hidden clues between the data, as if he were leaving a trail for me to follow. And finally, I found a point of convergence, the basement. I returned there with a flashlight and my heart pounding. This time, I searched with more determination. There was a section of the floor that seemed different. With effort, I lifted the wooden planks, revealing an old box. Inside, there were photos of the store from previous decades, and in each one, the man in the coat was there, always standing in the same spot. A faded note was at the bottom of the box. "Don't stare at him for too long, it was too late." I had already stared, followed, and tried to understand. The man was not just a figure. He was a presence, something that existed beyond the physical, yet manifested through every choice I made to try to unravel him. He wasn't just in the store. He was with me. By this point, everything in my life was in pieces. Friends had distanced themselves. Work was just a formality I could barely keep up with, and my days were consumed by this investigation. But I also knew I was close to an answer. Something was missing, a final piece to complete the puzzle. Clara mentioned in her diary something about a last encounter. The place was described vaguely, but I managed to identify an abandoned warehouse nearby that seemed to fit the description. That was where I needed to go. The abandoned warehouse was in a remote area, surrounded by decaying buildings and empty lots. I hesitated as I crossed the rusted gate, but an inexplicable force pushed me forward. It was as if all the pieces I had gathered had directed me to this moment. I carried with me Clara's diary, some personal notes, and a flashlight that seemed almost useless against the thick darkness. As I entered, the sound of my footsteps echoed. amplified by the empty walls. The space seemed larger than it should have, as if the warehouse had been distorted somehow. There were marks on the floor, lines scratched in circles that intertwined, forming complex patterns. In the center, a small object gleamed under the light of my flashlight. I approached slowly and realized it was a piece of old metal, perhaps a medallion or a key. I picked it up carefully, and that's when I heard the first sound, slow footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me. "Who's there?" My voice echoed, but no one answered. I turned quickly, trying to catch any movement in the darkness. The flashlight illuminated piles of wood and abandoned machinery, but there was something else there, something I couldn't identify. It was a presence, a nearly physical pressure in the air. And then I saw him. He was standing at the back, at the edge of the light's reach. The same dark coat, the same motionless posture. But something was different now. He didn't just seem to be watching me, he seemed to be waiting for something. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, not knowing what I expected as a response. He didn't move, but the feeling of being pulled toward him was almost irresistible. Every step I took seemed to require more effort, as if the air around me was becoming denser. When I finally got within a few meters of him, I realized his face was still impossible to discern. There were no features, but it wasn't empty either. It was an absence, a hole in the fabric of reality. And then he spoke. "You brought me here." The voice didn't come from him exactly, but surrounded me, inside my head. It was deep and cold, but carried a strange familiarity, as though I had heard it before. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to control the growing panic. "You know what I want." It was at that moment I realized he wasn't chasing me. I was creating him. Every doubt, every fear, every attempt to understand fed his existence. And now he was complete. A metallic sound echoed through the warehouse. I looked down and saw that the medallion I had been holding had fallen. It began to glow, pulsing with a bluish light that illuminated the patterns on the floor. The lines started to move, as if they were alive, and the man took a step toward me. "You can't run anymore," he said. My legs trembled, but I couldn't just give in. I grabbed the medallion again and held it tightly. I didn't know what to do, but something inside me told me this was the key to ending it all. The environment began to change. The walls of the warehouse seemed to melt, revealing an infinite emptiness beyond them. I was surrounded by nothing, trapped somewhere between reality and whatever plane he existed in. I had to make a decision. Face the man, risking everything in a direct confrontation. Use the medallion, even though I had no idea what it would really do. Abandon everything, try to escape, and leave the mystery unsolved. My mind spun with the possibilities, and the man continued to approach. He was only a few steps away from me. Everything around me was dissolving into emptiness, as if reality itself was disintegrating. I gripped the medallion tightly, feeling the cold metal against my skin as he got closer. The decision had to be made now. "Why me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in a space that no longer seemed physical. He stopped. The silence was deafening. Then the voice returned, colder and more final. "You always knew." A whirlwind of memories hit me. Fragments of the past I had tried to forget, mistakes, choices, buried secrets. It wasn't about the present. It was about everything I had tried to ignore, everything I had done to avoid facing who I really was. He wasn't just an external presence. He was the personification of something that had grown inside me for years. The light from the medallion pulsed again, stronger now. I felt a wave of energy rise up my arm, almost like an electric current. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw that his form was beginning to dissolve. It was as if he were melting into the light. "I won't let you in," I whispered, with a determination I didn't know I had. I moved toward the center of the circles, now glowing, and placed the medallion exactly where all the patterns converged. It started to vibrate, emitting a low sound, almost a hum. The presence of the man became more intense, as if he were resisting the force emanating from the object. "This won't save you," he said, now with a distorted voice, full of desperation and fury. I ignored his words and concentrated all my energy on the medallion. A burst of light exploded, and for a moment, everything disappeared. When I opened my eyes, I was on the floor of the warehouse. The emptiness was gone, as was he. The place now seemed normal, like any other warehouse. There were no signs of the circles or the glow, only the medallion in my hand, now dim. I slowly got up, still dazed. The silence was absolute, but no longer oppressive. I breathed deeply, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was a shadow in the corner, motionless. It wasn't him, but something smaller, like a residue. The medallion started to warm in my hand, and I realized it wasn't over. The following days felt like walking through thick fog. The medallion never glowed again, but I felt it still held something. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. Work, occasional meetings with friends, even the lonely nights at home. But nothing was truly normal. Lingering glances in the mirror revealed someone I barely recognized. My face was marked with lines that hadn't been there before, eyes tired from a weight that couldn't be seen, only felt. Every sudden sound, every shadow in motion, made me turn my head, expecting to see him there again. I spent hours trying to understand what had happened, reading old books, browsing obscure forums online, but the answers were always fragmented. That medallion seemed to be a key, but for what? A door to what? The origin of all this was bigger than me, bigger than anything I could conceive. One night, I decided to put the medallion in a drawer, out of my sight. Leave it behind, I thought. But when I closed the drawer, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine, the same chill I had felt when everything began. Days later, a message arrived on my phone. No sender, no record of delivery. Just one line of text. "You haven't finished what you started." My hand froze. I looked around, trying to identify any change in the environment. Nothing. The sound of my own breath seemed like thunder in the silence of the apartment. I stared at the phone for minutes, maybe hours, trying to decide whether to respond or simply throw the device out the window. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Maybe it would never end. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I began to avoid dark places. Even turning off all the lights before bed became an unbearable task. Friends asked if something was wrong, and I would just smile, changing the subject. The world wouldn't understand. Deep down, I knew my life had changed irreversibly. He may have disappeared, but his presence, or the idea of him, never left me. It was a constant reminder that there was something beyond what we can see, something that should never have been awakened. I looked at the medallion one last time before locking it in a steel box, hiding it in the farthest corner of my apartment. It wasn't enough, but it was all I could do. Then, on a gray morning, as I was walking to work, I felt a strange weight in my pocket. I reached in and found it there, glowing, pulsing as if it were part of something alive. I sold everything: the apartment, the furniture, even the car. I took the money and disappeared, moving to a place where no one could find me. I left no traces, and yet I felt something was still following me. I settled in a small town, a quiet place with few inhabitants. There, no one knew who I was or what had happened. I kept my name a secret, adopting a simple and nearly invisible routine. I thought that maybe distance and anonymity could give me peace. but the medallion always reappeared. No matter how many times I discarded it, burned it, or threw it into the deepest river I could find, it came back. Always in the same spot, beside my bed, pulsing gently as if it were breathing. In the last few weeks, I began to hear things at night. Sounds that didn't belong here. A low, persistent voice, whispering words I couldn't understand, but that were becoming increasingly familiar. On the last night, I woke up with the sensation of a hand touching my shoulder. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the medallion, glowing more intensely than ever. It doesn't want to let me go. And maybe, deep down, I've already accepted that I'll never truly be free. After all, some doors once opened can never be closed.